Every story has a conflict. This is what drives the drama. If Luke Skywalker hadn't gone missing, or if the princess didn't happen to be in another castle, you have very little incentive to get invested in the story. A conflict is a struggle between opposing forces. Sometimes these conflicts are something as big as good versus evil, and sometimes it's simply based on a misunderstanding. You can have more than one conflict, but you must have at least one for the reader to become or remain interested. No struggle equals no story. There are two types to talk about. The first is external conflicts. This is two outside forces battling it out, and we see the results of their conflict in typically tangible ways, in the ways that it influences the plot and the characters. Often one side is defeated and the other emerges victorious. And there are three types of external conflicts to be aware of. First, we'll talk about human versus human. This is the classic hero-villain struggle. There's a protagonist and an antagonist, and they are real characters in the story. Good guy v bad guy. Someone you root for against the person getting in the way of their goals. Human versus nature is the second type. This is when the protagonist is struggling against something bigger than themselves and out of their control. The character is fighting a battle against forces they can never hope to overcome. This doesn't always mean they'll lose, just that the forces they fight against are less of a direct enemy and more of a force of nature. Something that would have existed with its grand power and scale whether or not the character in the story is put into conflict with it. Perhaps the conflict revolves around fighting a natural disaster, or maybe like a massive creature, some sort of force of nature like. And this force will assert itself regardless of whether our main character engages with it in conflict or not, just like I said. And sometimes the victory is not in defeating it, but just surviving it. And the third is human versus society. Here, our protagonist is struggling against the law, the masses, ways of thinking, or injustices, and sees what's wrong with society while everyone else may be blind to it. And because our character perhaps has a unique way of seeing these things, this is where they need to fight against those injustices, or where they need to assert their virtues in a less than ideal world. It may not be a specific person or thing they engage into the conflict with, but the general ideas that the world around them holds or adheres to. Dystopian literature is a great example of this. There may be people that get in the hero's way, but ultimately the enemy is the status quo. Now, the other big type of conflict is internal conflict, where the struggle takes place not as an outside force, but it takes place within a character's head or within a character's mind. Usually there's a decision the character has to make, maybe an insecurity or a personal struggle that needs to be overcome to reach their goals, or maybe they're dealing with something like a split personality. You may have seen this represented by the famous devil on the shoulder image. Internal conflicts can take the form of like temptation to do wrong, or giving in, or overcoming those urges, and we often see the character's virtues blatantly displayed in these situations. And this can also be known as human versus self, if we want to carry on with that human versus motif. Conflicts are not mutually exclusive in stories. Indeed, a story can weave several of these together into one narrative structure. Perhaps you have a character that must overcome a personal struggle in the midst of an external conflict, and this just deepens our connection to the story. Conflicts are the ways that we can identify a character's motivations, virtues, and deeply held convictions based on how they react or respond to these challenges. This way, you can more easily identify your own struggles, and perhaps what we read can be a guide for you in how to utilize the virtues to respond to your conflict in the most courageous way possible.